Today, I'm going to present this article, Are Simultaneous Interpreters Expert Bilinguals? Unique Bilinguals are both. And this is actually an article that was part of my PhD work that I did in Italy. And so I wrote this article with my PhD supervisor.
Jag gjorde det tillsammans med min handledare. Och vi ska dyka in direkt för det är mycket att gå igenom. Så i grund och botten av den här artikeln handlar om vår hjärna och det faktum att vår hjärna är värdefull, den ändras hela tiden och den ändras beroende på vilka erfarenheter och vilka kunskaper vi får. Så vi vet
on the brain structure and also our cognitive processes, such as memory or kind of decision making. So a number of kind of skills can lead to expertise that then change the brain. So for example, learning to play the violin or learning to juggle can change your brain structure and also your cognitive processes. So these are both cases of kind of an expert skill. So somebody learns something well and they get to an expert level, and then they have certain benefits. And noted among expert benefits is this idea that experts have a better memory for things within their area of expertise. They also have benefits in all the processes that are used within that particular skill. Aside from these expert-based benefits, we also know that another life experience leads to benefits in the brain, and this is specifically speaking two or more languages. So why is this? Because a person who's bilingual or multilingual, they have both of these languages kind of in their brain, and they need to decide at every moment which language to use and which language to suppress. And so doing this every day, all day long, gives them a lot of training in that process. And what we've found is that that training kind of leads to a benefit to better functions, not just when they're switching between languages, but also when they're switching between other things. So then if we turn to interpreters, which is of course what we're interested in today, we can ask, well, how do these two things play together? On one hand, we can think of interpreters as kind of some type of super bilingual. And here in this paper, I've focused in on what I call simultaneous interpreters. Perhaps if I was writing it today, I would call them conference interpreters. But I'm thinking about that mode when they are interpreting simultaneously. And what we know is there's a lot of overlap between the two languages. So that probably leads to greater interference. So if we think that bilinguals get some benefit from kind of managing their two languages, then maybe interpreters get that even more because they have to do that to a greater extent. The other reality for interpreters is that there's a much higher demand to produce pure target language output. So this might also help them kind of reach a higher level with these bilingual benefits. However, we also know that interpreting is a skill. It's something that you learn. And so maybe interpreters also kind of have benefits similar to other experts. So that means benefits within their area of expertise. So specifically for interpreters, we might think that they have some benefit due to the higher memory requirement during interpreting, or to the simultaneous use of both languages, or maybe that they need to predict the coming input and maintain a high level of alertness. So in this study, we were asking the question, first of all, do interpreters show enhancements? Do they show better cognition? Are they faster? Can they remember more than people who are not interpreters? And then are those enhancements related to being bilingual, being an expert, or do they have enhancements from both, which could happen? So there is some previous evidence in this area. So when we're thinking about, are they kind of a super bilingual, we're looking at enhancements in domain general cognitive control. So it means not just when they're processing language, but also other areas of kind of the world. And there is some evidence that interpreters are better than multilinguals, or sorry, bilinguals in this case. They have better conflict resolution and also attentional control. On the other side, when we're looking for evidence that they are experts, we're looking for enhancements in memory and then the processes that are used within the domain of interpreting. And we have some evidence here as well. Interpreters have better verbal memory. They have less effect of something called an articulatory suppression effect, and they also have better lexical access, kind of retrieving words. So why do a study now if we already have some answers? The problem is that there are some issues with these studies. So on the one hand, most of the studies compared professional interpreters to bilingual students. And so there's an age difference. And we know that age also has an effect on cognition. So it would be best to have two groups that are around the same age. The other thing is that we know that most interpreters, or at least conference interpreters, are multilingual. They speak more than just two languages. And in these cases, they were compared to people who just spoke two languages. So it'd be better to have kind of a more equal comparison also in terms of the number of languages. So that's exactly what we did in this study. We recruited people who were professional conference interpreters, and then also multilinguals who were not interpreters. And this study was done in Brussels. So the interpreters were working at many of the EU institutions, and then everybody was living in this kind of bilingual environment. And importantly, these two groups were matched, so they were comparable when we looked at their age, at their number of native languages, and also their number of functional languages, so the number of languages they could use, really. And we asked them to do a number of tasks. Today, we're just going to focus on these first two. We're going to focus on their memory, and then also something called the task switching paradigm. So let's jump right into the memory tasks. We were interested in two types of memory, in something called short-term memory and then working memory. So short-term memory is memory for things that you can hold up to 30 seconds, but you can also increase this time through repetition of the thing you're trying to remember. And normally the capacity, meaning how many items we can remember, is about 4 to 5 different items at a time. A good example of short-term memory is trying to remember a phone number. So you might hear the phone number and then maybe you repeat it to yourself before dialing it or writing it down, or you might just, write it down or dial it within those 30 seconds. And when we're looking at this kind of in an experimental setting, we usually test this with something called a simple span task. Span meaning kind of the number of items that you can remember. Now, working memory is rather similar to short-term memory. It's also up to 30 seconds, and it can be increased through repetition, and the capacity here is thought to be about 4 to 7 objects, so roughly the same. The critical difference is that working memory needs to involve some type of processing. So an example of this is you hear that same series of numbers, that telephone number, but now instead of writing them down in the order you heard them, you need to reproduce them in the reverse order. So you've kind of processed the information. So now this is working memory. And when we use this in an experimental setting, we test it with something called backward span task, which is what I just described, a complex span task, and an end-back task. These are some examples. There are other options as well. Today, we're just going to focus on the simple span task and the complex span task, because these are what we used in this study. So this is what the simple span task looks like, which has short-term memory. Our participants saw a series of letters. So each of these rectangles represents kind of a separate screen they saw on the computer. So they saw a series of letters and then were asked to recall the letters. Now I should say they didn't not all of them were 3 letters long, some were longer, and we wanted to really give them a challenge. So we wanted to test the whole range to really find where they were. We didn't expect them to get 100% on these tasks. To give you a little bit of feel of what this looked like, we're actually going to do a little example here. So you'll see a series of letters, and then you can try to recall them. Now, since we're on Zoom, you can't all shout them out, so I'll just show you LVT. You can see how you did. Of course, remember, you're in a very different setting than our interpreters were in when they did these tasks. So that was our short-term memory task, or simple span task. But what about the working memory complex span task? So for this one, we had that same base of remembering or seeing a series of letters and then remembering them. But before each letter, they also saw an equation that they needed to solve. So this was the processing aspect of working memory. So we'll also do a little example of this. You'll see an equation. You can say whether it is true or false. And then you'll see a letter and then another equation. You can try to remember all of the letters. All right, so that was K, B, N that time. So let's see how our interpreters and our multilinguals did. So here we have the interpreters in blue and the multilinguals are in green. And then on the left side, we have short-term memory, and on the right side, we have working memory. And this is how many items you can remember. So we want more. You want to have a higher number rather than a lower number. And we see that interpreters do have higher or remembered more items than the multilinguals. And for both the short-term memory and the working memory, this was statistically significant. So this was a kind of a difference that we could trust was real and not just due to chance. So kind of to this first question of do they have better memory, we find that interpreters do have better memory than multilinguals. Now we'll look at that task switching paradigm. So for this task, our participants saw something like this on the screen. They saw this shape in the center and then this little bar above. And this bar of shapes indicated that the participant should tell us what the shape here was. So the answer would be heart. In other trials, other times they saw something like this. So they saw a row of colors. And so then they needed to indicate or tell us what the color of this shape is. So this answer would be red. So we had them do a whole bunch of this task just telling us the shape, and then a whole bunch of this task just telling us the color, and then we mix them all together. And when we mix them all together, it leads to two different types of trials. So the first is this second blue star here. And this is a repeat trial. And it's a repeat trial because the task they're doing on the current trial, so naming the color, is the same as the task they did on the previous trial. So they don't have to kind of re-remember the rules. They think, oh yeah, I was just doing color. Now I just have to do color again. The other type of trial is called a switch trial. And here they change which task they're doing. So if you look at this red heart, they now need to tell us the shape of the heart, whereas on the previous one, they just told us the color. So they have to kind of reconfigure in their head what they're doing. And this reconfiguration is called the switching cost. So we compare how long it takes them to do their switch trials to how long it takes them to do the repeat trials. What previous research has found is that bilinguals had an advantage on this switching cost. Now we can also look at one other thing here, and that's the mixing cost. And here we're comparing those repeat trials to when they did just the single task, just shape or just color. And what we're looking at here is kind of the difference in having to keep two task sets available for access. So when they're doing their repeat task, they're repeating the same trials or task, but they have to be ready to do something else or do the shape task or the color task on the next trial. Whereas in a single task, they can kind of just forget about that. And this is the place where we think that interpreters might have a benefit, that they are better at kind of maintaining two things in their head. And that's exactly what we found. We found that the interpreters had a smaller mixing cost than the multilinguals. Here, smaller is better. It's a cost. It's the extra time it takes to, so you want it to not take so much extra time. When we look at the switching cost, though, there's no difference between the two groups. So if we go back to that first question about, do they have benefits and are they related to being bilingual, being an expert, or both? Just to remind you of what those would look like. So we can place that verbal memory, that benefit in verbal memory in the expert column. And then this smaller mixing cost, or this being better at keeping track of two tasks, also goes in this expert column. So what we conclude is that interpreters are experts. They show enhancements in the cognitive abilities that are relied on during interpreting, but they do not continue to show these bilingual benefits beyond what they already have just for being bilingual. Thank you.